The lobby went completely silent. Not the polite kind of silence. Not the hush of people minding their business. This was the frozen, suffocating silence of a room full of people watching something happen and choosing to do absolutely nothing about it. Richard Caldwell's voice bounced off the marble floors and the vaulted ceilings and the expensive bronze fixtures of Hartwell Tower like a stone thrown into a glass room. He wasn't whispering. He wasn't pulling anyone aside. He was performing. And every single person in that lobby, the doorman, the concierge, the 3 business associates behind him, the young couple waiting for the elevator, every one of them heard exactly what he said. "Excuse me. Hey, I'm talking to you." The woman in the gray cleaning uniform didn't flinch. She kept her hand on the handle of her cart, her eyes calm, her posture steady. She turned slowly, the way someone turns when they already know what's coming and have decided they won't be moved by it. "Yes," she said. Caldwell looked her up and down like he was inspecting something left on the sidewalk. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, gold cufflinks catching the light. The kind of man who had learned long ago that wealth gave him the right to say whatever crossed his mind. "What exactly do you think you're doing using the front entrance?" he said. "Service staff uses the back. That's the rule. That's always been the rule." The woman looked at him steadily. "I was just passing through. Passing through." He repeated the words slowly, like they were ridiculous. Like the very idea of her passing through this lobby was something he needed to correct on behalf of the entire building. He turned to his associates, a small smirk forming on his face. "Did you hear that? She was just passing through." One of his associates laughed, a short, uncomfortable laugh, the kind people make when they're not sure what else to do. Caldwell turned back to the woman. He pointed at her cart, at her uniform, at the mop handle sticking up at the side like evidence of something shameful. "You're the cleaning crew, the maid. You don't pass through the front lobby. You come in through the back, you do your job quietly, and you leave the same way. That's what you're paid for." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look away. She simply said, "I understand your concern." And that calm, that absolute, unshakable calm, seemed to infuriate him more than any argument could have. "I want her removed," he said loudly, turning to the concierge. "I don't know why she's standing here talking to me. Do your job and have her escorted out." The concierge, a young man named Marcus who had worked this desk for 4 years and had never once caused a scene, went pale. He looked from Caldwell to the woman, and something passed across his face. Confusion, because Marcus had seen this woman hundreds of times. He had nodded to her every morning. He had watched her work with a quiet dignity that put most people in this building to shame. But Caldwell wasn't finished. "And make sure someone calls building management," he said. "I want to know how this kind of thing keeps happening. We pay a premium to live here. A premium. And I will not share the front entrance of this building with the cleaning staff." He straightened his jacket. He rolled his neck. And then he said the sentence that no one in that room would ever forget. "Someone like her has no business being in this space." The young couple by the elevator looked at each other. One of them reached for the other's hand. Marcus stared at the desk. The 3 associates stared at the floor. And the woman in the gray uniform looked at Richard Caldwell one more time, something shifting almost imperceptibly in her expression. Not anger, not hurt, but something closer to decision. And she said very quietly, "You might want to double-check that." Then she turned her cart and walked calmly toward the elevator. And Caldwell, certain that power and money and the sound of his own voice had already won this moment, did something that would destroy him completely. He called his attorney. Her name was Evelyn Marsh. She was 53 years old. She had worked in service her entire life, first as a hotel housekeeper at 17, then as a cleaning supervisor, then as someone who managed small crews across 3 commercial buildings on the south side. She had 2 daughters who called every Sunday. She had a small apartment on Fenwick Street that she had owned outright for 11 years. She drove a sensible car. She wore flat shoes. She brought her lunch in a blue container every single day. People made assumptions about Evelyn Marsh very quickly, and those assumptions were always the same. They looked at the uniform and saw the uniform. They looked at the cart and saw the cart. They heard her quiet voice and read it as smallness. They were wrong in ways that would take years for most of them to understand. Evelyn had grown up watching her mother clean other people's houses. She had watched her mother come home exhausted and still sit at the kitchen table and add numbers in a small brown notebook. Saving, she was moving penny by penny toward something no one around her quite believed in. Her mother used to say, "The goal is never to be seen working. The goal is to own the thing you're cleaning." Evelyn never forgot that. By the time she was 26, she had saved enough for a small down payment on a 2-unit property in a neighborhood most people called declining. She rented 1 unit. She lived in the other. She fixed things herself when they broke. She added value slowly, quietly, the way her mother had taught her to move through the world, without announcement, without fanfare. By 32, she had 2 more properties. By 40, 6. She had never taken a loan she couldn't calculate her way out of. She had never bought anything that didn't make financial sense. She read every document herself. She asked questions until she understood. And she kept showing up to work in her uniform because the income was steady, the health insurance was good, and because Evelyn Marsh had learned something most wealthy people never do, that looking like money and having money are 2 entirely different things. Her daughters knew. Her attorney knew. Her accountant knew. The people who passed her in lobbies and never looked up? They had no idea. And there was one more thing that nobody in Hartwell Tower knew. Not the doormen. Not the tenants. Not even Marcus at the concierge desk. Nobody knew why Evelyn came to this particular building. Every single morning. Why she requested this assignment specifically. Why, on the days she came in, she sometimes stood very still in the lobby and looked up at the ceiling with an expression that wasn't sadness. Exactly. But something older and quieter than that. There was something about Hartwell Tower that Evelyn Marsh had never told anyone. And Richard Caldwell had just made it absolutely impossible for her to stay quiet about it any longer. The attorney's name was Derek Foss, and he arrived 40 minutes later in a car that cost more than most people's annual salary. Caldwell had not calmed down. If anything, he had worked himself into a more elaborate version of his original anger. The kind of anger that starts as embarrassment and transforms itself into grievance. He had gathered the story of what happened and retold it to his associates twice in the interim, and each retelling made him sound more aggrieved and the woman in the gray uniform more out of place. By the time Foss arrived, Caldwell had constructed an entire narrative about the decline of standards in the building, about safety, about the right of residents to feel comfortable, about the fact that he paid north of $14,000 a month for his penthouse unit and that entitled him to certain expectations. "I want her removed from the building roster," he told Foss. "Whatever cleaning company they use, I want her specifically excluded. And I want a formal complaint filed with building management that is documented, dated, and placed in the official record." Foss nodded. He was used to this kind of assignment, a wealthy client with a grievance that was more about pride than practicality. He took out his notepad. "Has she said or done anything that could constitute harassment or breach of?" "She was insolent," Caldwell said. "She spoke back to me. She spoke back to you. In a tone that I found threatening." Foss wrote something down. "All right, I'll need to speak with building management and pull the service contracts. We'll send a formal notice." But Caldwell had one more thing to add. He said it in front of 4 people, including Marcus, who was still at his desk and who would later say in a formal statement that he wished he had spoken up in that moment. "I want it on record," Caldwell said loudly, "that I do not want that woman anywhere near my unit. I don't want her in my elevator. I don't want to look at her in the hallways. People like her have one job, and it is to be invisible. That's it. That is the entirety of her contribution to this building. To stay invisible." One of his associates shifted uncomfortably. The young woman from the couple by the elevator, who had stayed and was pretending to check her phone near the mailboxes, looked up sharply. Marcus stared at the surface of his desk. And Caldwell, satisfied with himself, straightened his cufflinks and told Foss to handle it. What he didn't see, what none of them saw, was the door to the building manager's office opening 6 inches. Enough for someone to hear. Enough for someone who had been on the phone inside that office to pause their call and listen to every single word Richard Caldwell just said. Her name was Patricia Huang, and she had managed Hartwell Tower for 9 years. She knew every tenant. She knew every service contract. She knew where every document in the building's history was filed. And when she heard what Caldwell was demanding, she closed the office door very quietly, sat back down at her desk, and pulled up a specific file on her computer that she had not opened in almost 2 years. She read it carefully. Then she picked up her phone and made a call that was not to Richard Caldwell's attorney. The call Patricia Huang made was to a woman named Sandra Reeve at the city property assessor's office. She didn't ask for anything dramatic. She just gave Sandra an address, the address of Hartwell Tower, and asked her to pull up the full ownership record, the deed, the chain of title, all of it. Sandra said she'd call back in 10 minutes. She called back in 6. What she told Patricia made Patricia sit very still for a long moment. Then she said, "Can you send that to me in writing?" Sandra said she could. Patricia thanked her, hung up, and sat at her desk staring at the wall. Meanwhile, Derek Foss was in the building manager's office waiting for Patricia to return, a leather folder open on his knee, ready to file the formal complaint Caldwell had requested. Patricia came back in. She sat down. She looked at Foss with the particular expression of someone who has to deliver unexpected information to a person who is going to find it very inconvenient. "Before we proceed," she said carefully, "I think there's something you and your client need to see." Foss raised an eyebrow. "If this is about the service contract." "It's not about the service contract," Patricia said. She turned her monitor around. Foss leaned forward. He read. His expression didn't change at first. Professionals are trained to maintain neutral expressions. But his pen stopped moving. His hand went still. He read the document again, more slowly this time, and then he looked up at Patricia with the expression of a man who has just realized that the ground beneath him is considerably less solid than he thought. "This is the building deed," he said. "Current and verified," Patricia said. "I had it confirmed 20 minutes ago." Foss set down his pen. "And the adjacent property on the north side? Same owner. And the building across Hartwell Street as well," Patricia said. "Yes." Foss was quiet for a moment. A long moment. "My client's penthouse," he said slowly. "The unit he's been leasing for 3 years. Owned by the same person," Patricia said. "And I believe your client signed a lease renewal 14 months ago. The signature on the ownership side of that document." She paused. She let the pause do its work. "Is the woman your client just asked me to remove from the building?" The silence that followed was the kind that has physical weight. Foss closed his leather folder. Somewhere in the building, Richard Caldwell was pouring himself a drink and telling himself that he had handled the situation appropriately. He had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to him. Evelyn Marsh had not arrived at Hartwell Tower by accident. This was the part that would come out slowly over the following hours, and each new layer of it would reshape the story entirely. Not just for Richard Caldwell, but for everyone who had ever passed through that lobby and made assumptions about the woman with the cleaning cart. Patricia Huang called Evelyn directly. She had the number because it was in the file she had never fully examined because no one had ever given her reason to. When Evelyn answered, her voice was the same as always. Calm. Measured. "Ms. Marsh," Patricia said, "I want to apologize on behalf of this building for what happened this morning." "You don't need to apologize," Evelyn said. "But I do think we should talk." They met in the building manager's office. And for the next hour, Patricia Huang learned things about Hartwell Tower that she had managed for 9 years without ever knowing. Evelyn had purchased the first stake in the building's ownership structure 11 years ago. It was not a dramatic acquisition, not a headline, not a press release. It was a quiet position in a property group that most investors had overlooked because the building was carrying debt and needed renovation capital. Evelyn had looked at the numbers. She had done the math that the bigger investors had not bothered to do. She had moved. Over the following years, as other stakeholders sold their positions, Evelyn bought. Slowly, carefully, the way she did everything. By the time Hartwell Tower had been renovated and rebranded and had become one of the most desirable addresses in the city, Evelyn Marsh's ownership position had become the controlling position. She hadn't told the management company. She wasn't required to. The leases were structured through a property holding entity with a name that told you nothing, Marsh Capital Holdings, and most people had never looked past the company name to the person behind it. Richard Caldwell had signed his lease with Marsh Capital Holdings. He had renewed it. He had paid his rent, $14,000 a month, for 36 consecutive months. He had been paying Evelyn Marsh for 3 years, every single month. And then Patricia told Evelyn the most important part, the part that made everything else make sense. She showed Evelyn the formal complaint that Foss had begun drafting, the language Caldwell had used, the request to have her excluded, the statement about wanting her invisible. Evelyn read it. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she asked Patricia for a copy. "What are you going to do?" Patricia asked. "What I should have done this morning," Evelyn said quietly. "Tell the truth." But even now, even as the documentation was being assembled and Foss was in the lobby making very uncomfortable phone calls, there was one more thing that hadn't come out yet. One thing that explained why Evelyn had requested this building assignment. Why she came here specifically. Her mother had cleaned this building. For 22 years, Dolores Marsh had come through the back entrance of what was then called Alderton Commercial Tower, before the renovation, before the rebrand, and she had cleaned its floors and its windows and its lobby. She had been invisible in exactly the way Caldwell had demanded of her daughter. She had retired from this building with a small pension and tired hands and the satisfaction of a woman who had spent her whole life preparing someone else for something better. Evelyn came to this building every week not because she needed to, not because the cleaning work required her presence. She came because her mother had walked these floors for 22 years, and Evelyn owned them now, and sometimes on a quiet morning, she needed to stand in that lobby and remember why. Richard Caldwell had no idea that the woman he called just a maid had purchased the building where her mother was once invisible, so that her mother's story would never be invisible again. What happened next moved faster than Caldwell's attorney could contain it. Marcus, the concierge, had been quiet all morning. But when 2 other tenants separately approached his desk and asked him what they had witnessed in the lobby, he told them. Factually. Completely. With the detail of someone who had been a witness and had decided that being a witness came with responsibility. The young woman who had been standing by the mailboxes, her name was Priya Anand, and she was a journalist, though not the kind who announces herself at cocktail parties, had already made 3 phone calls of her own by the time Marcus spoke. By early afternoon, the story was moving through the building like a current. Patricia Huang confirmed the ownership records to anyone who asked directly. She was not in the business of drama, but she was very much in the business of accuracy, and the accuracy of the situation was this. The woman Richard Caldwell had attempted to have removed was the owner of the building Richard Caldwell lived in. When Foss finally reached Caldwell with this information in the lobby because Caldwell had come downstairs to check on the progress of his complaint, the scene that followed was witnessed by 11 people. Caldwell's face went through several changes in rapid succession. Disbelief, recalibration, something that might have been panic beneath the practiced exterior. "That's not possible," he said. "I've verified it with the assessor's office and with the holding company's registration documents," Foss said quietly, very aware of the people around them. "It's accurate." "She was wearing a uniform," Caldwell said, and even as the words came out, he seemed to understand how they sounded. He looked around at the lobby, at Marcus, Priya, who had her phone in her hand, at 3 other residents who had conveniently found reasons to be in the lobby at this particular moment. "The ownership," Foss continued carefully, "extends to this building, the adjacent property, and the building on Harwell Street. Your lease." "I know what my lease is," Caldwell snapped. "Your lease," Foss repeated, "is with Marsh Capital Holdings. The principal of that holding company is Evelyn Marsh." He paused. "The woman you asked to have removed this morning." The lobby was very quiet. Marcus, behind his desk, straightened a small stack of papers that didn't need straightening. Priya Anand typed something on her phone. And Richard Caldwell, who had stood in the same lobby 4 hours ago and told the room that certain people had one job and that job was to be invisible, stood completely still and for the first time in what was likely a very long time, found that he had absolutely nothing to say. Have you ever watched someone be exposed by their own arrogance? Tell us in the comments what went through your mind. Evelyn walked back into the lobby at 4:15 in the afternoon. She was still wearing the gray uniform. She hadn't gone home to change. She hadn't called a publicist or assembled a team or rehearsed anything. She walked in through the front entrance, past Marcus, who stood up straighter when he saw her and gave her a nod that contained an entire apology. And she went to the building manager's office where Patricia Huang, Derek Foss, and Richard Caldwell were waiting. Caldwell had composed himself. That was the word his face was communicating, composed. He had rearranged his expression into something that was meant to look like a man who had made an understandable mistake and was prepared to address it professionally. He opened with, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There hasn't been," Evelyn said. She sat down. She placed a folder on the table. "This morning you told the people in this lobby that I had no business being in this space. You asked for me to be removed. You told the building staff that my job was to be invisible." She looked at him directly. "I'd like to talk about the lease." Caldwell looked at Foss. Foss looked at the table. "The lease for your penthouse unit," Evelyn continued, "comes up for review in 90 days. Standard renewal terms have historically been offered to long-term residents." She paused. "I want to be clear that I intend to honor that process. I'm not here to retaliate. That's not why I do what I do." Caldwell blinked. He had clearly prepared for something else. An ultimatum. A confrontation he could negotiate his way out of with money. What he had not prepared for was grace. "What I am here to say," Evelyn continued, "is that the formal complaint you filed with this building, the language you used about certain people having one job, about remaining invisible, I'd like that withdrawn. In writing. Today." "That's," Caldwell started. "And I'd like a written statement from you acknowledging that what took place in this lobby this morning was inappropriate." She said it without heat, without satisfaction, like she was reading items off a practical list. There was a long silence. Foss leaned toward Caldwell and said something quietly. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He nodded once, a small, stiff motion. "Fine," he said. The word came out like something it cost him enormously to produce. But that wasn't the moment that would stay with the people in that room. The moment that stayed was what happened after the documents were signed and Caldwell was preparing to leave. He paused at the door, and to whatever credit exists in him, he turned around. He looked at Evelyn, and he said, with something that was not quite an apology but was the closest he was capable of getting, "I didn't know who you were." And Evelyn Marsh looked at him with those steady, quiet eyes, and she said the 6 words that Marcus would repeat to people for years afterward, the 6 words that Priya Anand would quote in the piece she eventually wrote, the 6 words that ended up as a caption beneath a photograph of the lobby. That was never the point. The building at Hartwell Tower didn't change overnight. The marble floors were the same. The bronze fixtures caught the same morning light. Marcus was still at the concierge desk, nodding to people as they came and went. The elevators still hummed on their cables, carrying their residents up and down through a building that had stories pressed into every wall. But things were different in ways that mattered. Priya Anand's piece ran 3 weeks later. It wasn't the exposé version. It wasn't designed to destroy anyone. It was the kind of story that asked readers to look at the people they passed every morning and consider what they didn't know about them. It was read widely. It was shared more widely. It found its way to people who needed it in different ways for different reasons. Richard Caldwell did not renew his lease. He left 6 weeks before the 90 days were up, quietly and without announcement. Whether shame or pride drove the decision, no one could say for certain. He moved to another building across the city, one whose ownership structure presumably he researched first. Evelyn's daughters called the Sunday after it all happened, the way they always called. The youngest one had seen something about it online. She asked her mother how she felt. Evelyn thought about that for a moment. She thought about the lobby. She thought about her mother coming through the back entrance for 22 years. She thought about the brown notebook on the kitchen table and the numbers her mother added in it late at night. She thought about the morning she had stood in that lobby, not as a cleaning worker, but as the owner of every inch of ground beneath her feet, and had looked up at the ceiling and felt her mother's 22 years of invisible labor somehow transformed into something permanent and hers. "I feel fine," she told her daughter. "I feel like your grandmother would have laughed." Her daughter laughed too. Marcus got a formal commendation in the building's internal records, Patricia Huang's doing, for maintaining professional conduct under pressure. He keeps it in a frame above his desk, though he is too modest to point it out to anyone. Patricia Huang, who had managed Hartwell Tower for 9 years without ever pulling that ownership file, changed her onboarding process. Every new staff member now receives the full ownership documentation for the building as part of their first week. "Know the building completely," she tells them. "Every level of it." As for Evelyn Marsh, she still takes the morning assignment when she wants to. She still comes through the front entrance. She still nods to people who don't nod back, though a few more of them do now. She still brings lunch in the blue container. She still drives the sensible car. She is still, in most ways that are visible, exactly who she has always been. And that is precisely the point. Because the lesson Richard Caldwell learned that day, the lesson that cost him his composure, his formal complaint, his penthouse lease, and whatever certainty he had once carried about how the world was organized, was not a complicated one. It was, in fact, the oldest and most consistently ignored lesson in the history of human beings misjudging each other. Wealth is not always loud. Power is not always dressed the way you expect. The person you dismiss as irrelevant may be the very person who holds the keys to everything you value. And the quiet ones, the ones who smile while you perform your certainty at them, who keep their hands steady while your voice rises, who say you might want to double-check that in the calmest possible tone, are often the ones who have spent 20 years building something so solid that no amount of noise can touch it. Evelyn Marsh did not teach Richard Caldwell this lesson to be cruel. She did not engineer his humiliation. She simply refused to be erased by it. She simply continued being exactly who she was until the truth became impossible to ignore. And the truth was this. She had never been just a maid. She had always been the woman who owned the building. The quietest person in the room is often the one who owns it, and the ones who mistake humility for weakness are always the last to understand why that costs them everything.